Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are excited to continue our webinar series with Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. We are going to hear from Steve Stevens today with Convergent, and he's going to be talking about the role of chambers of commerce in public-private partnerships. As a reminder, we're going to keep you on mute as Steve kind of goes through his presentation, but feel free to use the chat feature if you have any questions, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end if you would like to unmute yourself and ask questions as well. Also, you will get an email from me later today with a copy of Steve's slides and also a link of this recording if you need to go back and look at anything. You'll also get Steve's contact information if you'd like to ask him any questions after you had a chance to review the session today. But with that, Steve, thanks so much for being on with us. We're excited to hear from you today.
Well, thanks, Tiffany, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And if you are watching this recording later on, I hope you get some value out of this and the role of chambers of commerce in public-private partnerships. I have had the good fortune of working with multiple organizations over my career as a chamber of commerce and economic development executive, and I've seen these things in practice and know how powerful they can be. I also know of many communities who have made great use of them, and we'll talk about a few of those examples later on in the presentation, but some that you might want to check out because they may have direct application to some of the things that you are interested in your community for the variety of things that a public-private partnership can be useful to help you accomplish. So again, just a little bit about my background. I spent nearly 30 years doing chambers of commerce and economic development work in a couple of different places. Started my career at the Kentucky Chamber as a government affairs professional, and then my home is in the northernmost part of Kentucky at the greater Cincinnati area, and was able to spend a 20-year career at the chamber that is across that northern Kentucky section of the state, and worked in a lot of different types of projects and infrastructure and things like that that worked well with this, as well as Washington State, where I was also a CEO of an economic development and chamber of commerce combined organization. And then ultimately spent time with the Realtor Association in Kentucky, working with those who are really involved in real estate deals, which real estate sometimes is part of public-private partnerships. And so we did a whole lot of work there. So anyway, enough about my background. Let's just talk a bit about public-private partnerships. So, when we have webinars like this, we know that there are people that come from a wide range of knowledge bases with the subjects that we cover. So we'll do a little bit of a primer for those of you who are not that familiar with P3s. I'll refer to them as that. It's a short way to say public-private partnership. But P3s will have a little bit of a primer on that. And then we'll get more specific about what they do and then what they can accomplish, but why it's important that chambers are involved in them. And then ultimately a couple of the examples, some of which you may be familiar with because I chose an example or two that come from your specific region. And then there are some others out there that you may even want to check out later on. So what is a public-private partnership? Well, it's a real simple definition, really. It's a collaboration, and it's one between government and the private sector, and the private sector being businesses and organizations that represent the private sector. And the reason we do it, is because we can share resources. And with that also, we share the risk and the rewards that we have because we are working together. And we come together to do these big projects and big initiatives because we realize that by ourselves, we probably couldn't accomplish all that we could with bringing the power and the skills and the resources of all the parties that we invite to be part of a public-private partnership. So we couldn't possibly achieve the magnitude of results on our own. So that's why we come together and form these. So Why do they matter? Well, P3s can really drive economic growth. And isn't that what chambers are all about? They're interested in that, and they're interested in supporting the business community. And as I mentioned, we leverage resources because all of us bring something to the table. That's why we're being invited to be part of a P3. And, because the private sector is involved in it, we often have faster and more efficient project completion than when government by itself runs it. And it's not to slight our government partners because they're very important to us and we establish great partnerships. But we all know that there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of hoops to jump through when you have to do a government run project. And they just are bogged down with a lot of the things they have to do to follow procedures, processes, bureaucracy. And ultimately, when we do a P3, government is involved, but they may not necessarily be managing it in a way that we have to, rely on going through all of their processes. We can make it go faster. And P3s can really do some wonderful things to revitalize communities and really enhance not only commerce and economic growth, but tourism and quality of life in a community, and also those things translate into job creation. And we'll talk about that too in a minute. So they're getting more frequently used. And why is that? Well, frankly, we all know that governments are having more and more trouble keeping up with the demand of things that need to be done in the community, specifically when it comes to infrastructure. There's just not enough dollars to go around. We have to keep up with highways, and we have to keep up with bridges, and we have to build public facilities and things like that. And, unless you don't mind being taxed continuously and seeing your taxes increase to pay for those things, clearly things just get pushed down, on a list. And then finally, hopefully emerge as one of the top projects that they'll get involved in completing. So, we're using P3s to really find ways to get the projects done in a quicker way, bring other resources to the table in addition to government funds. And then public oversight with private efficiency, really can help, with the financial constraints of government. When it's not just the government having to do all the work, private sector can really create efficiency that even helps things cost less. And that's very important. So let's talk about how they're used. Well, we've already talked about economic development. Economic development, is a broad term, as we know. And, in the context of this and some of the projects that we'll talk about, we've seen some big development happen, along riverfronts to revitalize areas. Mixed use developments can occur that can drive, business growth in certain parts of a community or a region. So that is extremely helpful to revitalizing a community. Sometimes you'll see services that are public-private partnerships. And so things like workforce development fall into the public-private partnerships, the training consortiums that can be created, and partnerships between the public sector and education and the private sector, and really help address some of the workforce shortages that we see across the entire country, and really help us fill some of the gaps that we're missing relative to workforce. I mentioned infrastructure already, but upgrading roads and bridges and even utilities, P3s are useful for. And then public spaces, quality of life initiatives, parks, even things like flood mitigation that really can put some land into new use that could then be developed and create economic development and other beneficial quality of life elements for the community. So they can come in a lot of forms. Here's a couple of them. Sometimes a public-private partnership can be a contract between government and the private sector to design and build a particular piece of infrastructure or community service or community building of some sort. We can see them as management contracts where you have someone overseeing an entire project, and it's a private sector entity that's actually doing the management of it, and government is providing some funding and then some governance elements of it. Then lease agreements again, or some others. So each type of P3 really creates new responsibilities and roles for both the public and private sector that come together to form this P3. There are a variety of creative ways to fund P3s. And when we talk about that, we know that there are both public funds and private funds that can come into P3s and the projects that they're involved in. So if you look at the public funding, you'll be familiar with the fact that, governments, can make direct allocations out of their various budgets and their general funds. They can actually give grants for particular projects that could be funded, and then also they can raise taxes or fees that help to pay for certain things. We'll get into a little more of that later. But on the other hand, private funding can come from investments that companies want to make that they will then have in the agreement that they will get a return for doing because they're fronting the money for the project. Banks and financial institutions often will loan money and then, of course, get a return for that, and can also even give their own money or grants as well, because sometimes they have those. But there's a variety of ways. And then companies can actually recover their costs in a variety of ways. So oftentimes you'll see a project that's in a P3 where the private sector puts all the money up front for the construction or the service delivery. And you say, okay, why would they do that? Well, they're probably looking for a return. And that cost recovery that they're looking for can come from a user fee. You think about things that or like bridges and roads and things like that, where there are tolls, and or the government pays the company back over time for investing what they didn't have the ability to fund at the time because they had a lot of mouths to feed, or they're a smaller government and a larger company said, yeah, we'll take this on. You see this a little bit too, even at universities, where universities now are starting to contract with companies to, manage their dormitory space and build them. And then they receive payment for it, and they actually are making some money as a result of it. But when you talk about user fees and tolls, those are considered a lot more fair and acceptable than if the government was just going to assess a tax. And the reason is because specifically only the people then that are using that particular piece of infrastructure or whatever the project is are the ones that are actually paying for it. So the rest of the folks, if they say, look, well, I don't drive, I'm not using this public transportation, why should I have to pay? Well, you're not, because others are as a result of them using it. So the benefits to all this, what are they? Well, less government spending and more private investment activity. What does that lead to? That's job creation, guys. And that's what we love. We like to see that. And we need to see economic activity that comes from the private sector and job creation. That's what really makes an economy go. It's not the government doing it all. So that's what we are looking for. I call this the PPP effect, the P3 effect, and that is job creation, right? P3 projects often require a workforce, and that workforce is employed so the project can get done. There's wages that are paid, taxes that come from wages, you name it, and the economy grows and churns. That's great. When you do bigger infrastructure projects through P3s, hey, man, it creates opportunities for local businesses around, whether it's them because they provide materials or services that help the project get done. Maybe it's because this project's going on right in your community and there is a workforce that now needs various things, various services. They need places to eat. They need all sorts of things. So those businesses are benefiting as a result. Training programs may be part of P3 agreements because certain skill sets are needed to be able to do the project. And so, that enhances the employability of people for once these projects are done, these folks can be even better employed later on with other kinds of work and positions that might have been a greater opportunity than they had going into it as a result of the training that came from it. And then finally, you might see even a new business or two that comes along during a project because there was a demand for a service or a particular project, material or something like that. So a business may actually spring up in the community where you are. So that is job creation. So now the moment you've been waiting for is this webinar was to talk about how, what's the role of chambers of commerce in this whole big P3 scheme. And the fact is, we are perfectly positioned to be involved in these because we make great catalysts to get this kind of thing going and facilitators of P3s. And the main reason is that P3s require a convener and a neutral platform. There are people that identify a need, and they look at a chamber of commerce as somebody who is a neutral platform and a trusted convener. And chambers are seen as honest brokers, and they don't represent one company or a political agenda. They represent the broad business community, and they provide a very safe, neutral space for both, government leaders and private businesses, and even community stakeholders that are invited to be a part of this to sit down and collaborate to build a project. Chambers of commerce are always looked at for their deep local knowledge. Chambers have the pulse on a local community and the economic needs that it has. They know where the workforce gaps are. They know where the community's priorities are. And so they make perfect conveners and facilitators. And they understand that the business climate and the public policy environment need to kind of align with one another. And it allows them to connect the right partners at the right time on these projects. Chambers, you well know because you run them, provide broad and diverse networks. They bring together businesses of all sizes and industries and from various sectors. Their access to both grassroots, small businesses, and large employers helps balance the perspectives in the partnerships that are created. Advocacy and influence, we know that they're skilled. Chambers are skilled at engaging policy makers, and they can navigate government processes very well. They sit in front of city councils, county councils, you name it, and discuss issues all the time. They are familiar to them as well as of them, and they can align private sector goals with public priorities, and they can build the support and the momentum that projects need to get across the finish line. From a project management and facilitation standpoint, we know that chambers often manage initiatives that require coordination of multiple stakeholders, multiple funding streams, and also, staying on a timeline. So they are great at that, and you have many people within your memberships that can assist in this, and you can keep partnerships moving and ensure that there is accountability as we go through the whole project. And at the end, we're great at throwing a party to celebrate the results of what's happened after we've accomplished the goal. And then the long-term perspective, we are unlike political offices with short election cycles. Chambers are enduring institutions, and we maintain continuity that spans years rather than just election cycles. And that ensures that partnerships really last and outlast the individual administrations that obviously we know are going to be there and come and go. And then finally, I think it's great that we are often looked at as problem solvers. Chambers, it should always be looked at as somebody that's solution oriented and focused on outcomes that grow jobs, grow investment, and then ultimately help the community prosper. Um, we have been good for 100 years plus at cutting through the silos and the bureaucracy to really make things happen in our communities. And so that is a really positive thing. So we really thrive as catalysts for P3s because we can be great connectors, conveners, and champions for business growth. So, what are the keys to successful P3s? If you decide, hey, I'm a chamber that can accomplish some of these things, I'm looking for a way to get a big need, a big project off the ground and accomplished in my community. So, there's some keys here to really be successful. First of all, everybody has to know and understand and agree on what our mutual interest in the project or initiative. I mean, we all probably come into a project like this with a bit of our own selfish need or want in the project, but hopefully we can align all of those together and understand that we want this thing for a common good or common need that we can all get our arms around. We have to also know how we're going to measure the success that's going to come from this project. And we got to know when we hit success. Some of these projects can last so long that by the time they get near the finish line, a lot of folks have forgotten why we got this thing started in the first place. So making sure we're going to understand how to measure the success we're going to see, and we've got to do that in the short term and the long term, and that keeps all the folks hitched to the wagon, basically. So setting short term and long term goals is really helpful because it also keeps people encouraged, keeps people feeling like we're making progress, and everybody sticks together. We have to understand from the get-go what our roles are. As we come together to be a partner in a P3, everybody comes to the table with something to offer. Otherwise, you aren't going to be part of the P3. So what are the roles and what are the responsibilities and what is the agreement that we all give when we say we're forming a P3 that we're going to accomplish? We've got to agree on the financial obligations. If the private sector says they're going to put skin in the game and the government says they are, what does that look like? Let's make sure we put it down in writing. And we also then understand, we're going to risk these amounts or something. And we are therefore also going to be rewarded at the end with maybe a new project or a return on the investment that we've put in to this project. There needs to be a very sound governance structure. That does not mean that government will be the governance structure. There may be a board of directors of some sort that is created, and who is accountable on that. Each of the stakeholders are going to have a representation in the P3. What is that going to look like? And make sure we really outline that in writing so everybody knows what that is and agrees to it. And then finally, just like any good business would do, let's write a business plan. Let's get everything lined out for short and long term with goals and methods to get there, and then ultimately outcomes that are planned along the way, and then also showing how we're going to fund each of these as we go forward. And that would be a sound business plan. Let's talk about a couple of projects that are a couple of P3s that I think are really interesting, that some of which I think already. Let's start with the Carolinas. There's a couple here that I think you'll recognize, some of you. Greenville, South Carolina's next innovation hub is extremely, successful. The city of Greenville, Greenville County, and the Greenville Chamber, via the foundation that the chamber has, really came together to make some significant financial investments to support this P3. And it was originally a program of the Greenville Chamber, but was transitioned under the foundation so it could have a 501c3 status. And why is that important? Well, that, allowed for funding to flow from both public and private sector, sometimes foundation to foundation to contribute. And it really enabled some improved governance and expanded partnerships and access to more diverse resources. And some of the accomplishments have been, that it operates as a regional entrepreneurial ecosystem that provides workspace, mentorship, networking opportunities for folks. It's impacting about 120 knowledge-based companies in upstate South Carolina, in the Greenville area. And while there's really not a precise economic impact number, I think there have been some folks that have mentioned it probably has generated at least $1 billion in economic activity, which is huge, and really recognized as a substantial driver when it comes to what they are doing for innovation and business growth in that Greenville area. So a very cool project. This research triangle logo really represents a workforce partnership that it was funded with a $1.2 million federal community project funding grant secured by a congressional member, and then it supports workforce training in biotech and also biomanufacturing. And then, NC Bio Impact emerged from a 2003 workforce needs study. And, there have been some tremendous things that have happened. Bio Impact is a coalition of biotech industry leaders, academic institutions, some nonprofits in the North Carolina Biotechnology Center that have come together and really worked hard to provide, in training, apprenticeship programs, high school pathways, career development services for biomanufacturing workforce development, and coordinating a lot of great training and education across University of North Carolina and community college systems. So some real great workforce and entrepreneurship things going on with these two programs. I'm going to go closer to home for me, and I'm going to talk to you about BEAM and Prosper 2030. So this spans across a region of Kentucky from where I live, just outside the Lexington area. I live in Greater Lexington, which is right in the heart of the state. And BEAM really kind of goes between and connects both Lexington and Louisville together. Prosper 2030 is a regional strategic plan that was created that's seeking, about $4 million over 5 years for its operation, and, some real specific needs that it has identified for talent attraction too, with Greater Louisville Inc. Greater Louisville Inc. being the Chamber of Commerce and some economic development activity that they do in Louisville. And it plans to build on GLI's leadership and investor base and stakeholder oversight to go after 6,000 new jobs to be created in the region, and work on advocacy and policy to really be business friendly to help grow the working age population from where it is today by at least 41,000 new jobs or new workforce into the workforce base. And where do they think they'll end up? Well, they think that if they do all these things, that there'll be about a $6.8 billion regional economic impact. So it's a very aggressive goal, but they are out to do it and a very forward-looking strategy. But again, GLI and Commerce Lexington in Lexington, working with all the partners in between and working with government and pulling all the resources together to do that. But that's a very powerful group working on that. Let me go a little further to the west now, though, and talk to you about the Quad Cities and what they're up to. The Quad Cities are doing riverfront development. As you know, they're kind of along the river there, and Davenport, Iowa, and a few of the other communities that are nearby on both sides of the river in both Iowa and Illinois. The funding they got was a $9.6 million grant from the state of Iowa's Economic Development Authority. And then they started with the Destination Iowa program that was funded with a federal ARPA grant too. And they made a big investment that was a public-private investment in the Davenport riverfront area. And it was led by the Downtown Davenport Partnership in coordination with the Quad Cities Chamber and also Visit Quad Cities, their destination marketing activity, and all the local and state government entities on those both sides of the river. And those groups played, a real important role in advocacy and coordination to secure and guide the investment of dollars. And so far, what they've been able to accomplish is it's really been a transformation along that riverfront. They have done, I mentioned before, you could use money for flood mitigation. That was so critical for them to be able to make that land usable and then begin the whole redevelopment of it and improve public spaces with those dollars and enhanced aesthetics. They put lighting in. There's an art museum down along the riverfront to really help drive both residential and commercial growth along that riverfront. And they're seeing lots and lots of economic activity as a result of that. So what else is out there? I mean, you probably have some other thoughts and examples that you could bring to bear now that you kind of have the feel for what these are and maybe seeing some in your own community. I've listed a couple others here. There are chambers that are involved in these things now in Omaha, Nebraska, Nashville, Tennessee, El Paso, Texas, Asheville, North Carolina, all over the place. Omaha, Nebraska, for instance, is a partnership between the chamber, local community colleges, some major employees, and their city government. And its focus is, specific workforce pipelines in IT, advanced manufacturing, and healthcare. They are getting thousands of people trained and placed in very high demand jobs that they have in that area. So they're aligning with, employer needs and aligning the education that's required for those employers. And the chamber served as a neutral convener in this case to create this partnership, and they ensured that business needs guided the program design while they went after the public funding support. And we talked about Greenville, but what about Nashville? Nashville had a partnership between the chamber, some of the regional mayors of the area, and the State Department of Transportation and the business community. And they were advocating and working on funding strategies for some major transportation improvements they needed. So they secured state and federal support for expanding the highways, the mass transit initiatives, and even some of the freight corridors that needed to be improved so it would improve commerce. And so the outcome was they secured state and federal support for those expanded highways and initiatives. And then the chamber really leveraged its business coalition to show real broad support, making the case that infrastructure investment was critical for economic growth. And folks, that's why it worked. quite honestly, the chamber was in the middle of it. El Paso, Texas, I'll just mention, had a partnership between the chamber, the city, the military, and a lot of times that's a powerful partnership, and some private companies. And they were really working hard to try to retain one of their military installations, and it was Fort Bliss, which they saw as a very big and key economic driver in that region during the federal base realignment that was going on across the country. And so, instead of being downsized or eliminated, this partnership was so strong that Fort Bliss ended up being expanded, and it was adding jobs rather than decreasing jobs. And the reason it worked was the chamber really unified a business voice and mobilized their grassroots support, partnered with local government to present a very compelling case to federal decision makers, and they decided to expand that base. Lastly, I had listed Asheville on here in the Asheville Chamber. They had a partnership between the chamber and the county and healthcare providers and some nonprofits. Their focus on this initiative was living wage and best places to work initiatives, as well as some talent attraction that they wanted to do. So the outcome of their partnership was they enhanced the region's reputation as a top place to live and work, and they supported both, economic growth and community well-being through their living wage initiative. And the reason it worked was that the chamber was able to balance the private sector goals and the growth goals they had with some community priorities that had emerged relative to wages, and it really created a win-win for both business and the residents that live there. So, be interested to hear what examples you're seeing that are making an impact on community and economic development, because there are many. Some of you could probably even elaborate on the ones I mentioned in the Carolinas, because you are there and you've probably seen even more than I've mentioned, which would be great. So what do you think the future is for P3s? Well, as we see it, P3s are becoming more important. As urban areas expand, infrastructure needs are not getting any less, and the budgets are more constrained, you're going to probably see more of these. And it's going to be really important that chambers are doing these, and you're empowering your boards to take a look at these and say, let's be the problem solver. Let's create a P3. Let's help facilitate and convene a group that will solve this issue. And again, we can structure these so that we limit government power and promote private sector creativity. And I don't mean that negatively about limiting government power, but the private sector seems to be really good at getting things done and moving things forward quickly. And so, we can say, hey guys in government, we can do this with your support, but you don't have to take the lead here. We'll take the lead, and we'll get this job done. The future is also expected to focus on real public benefits. And as we all see competition getting more and more difficult, community-oriented decision-making is going to be important in how we come to be competitive with other places. So if you have questions, love to hear about them. And my contact information is here. Certainly shoot an email. And then also, this will be sent to you so that you'll be able to review it again, and you'll be able to see this. And then lastly, I have a page of some links here to some really good websites that will give you some good extra information on this whole idea of public-private partnerships, some very good detailed information, and actually some specific examples. And I am not just trying to promote my state when I say this, but the Kentucky Chamber has a very good piece that they had written, spent a lot of time and I think money on producing, but private solutions to public problems. And it lists a variety of things where this whole idea of P3s is useful to try to address them. So with that,
That's
thank you very
great,
much.
Steve. That's great. Thank you so much. Such good information. Couple of questions for you. So, as a Chamber of Commerce, how would you start as far as who would you convene to kind of see what the major issues are within the business community or the community as a whole? Do you start with your board? Do you do focus groups of all members? What would you suggest?
Well, I think the board is absolutely essential. You must keep your leadership in the loop on that, and that would be the start. And if they're not behind you, then you're gonna probably struggle to get it moved forward. But let's start with our board, and then beyond that, it depends on who and where that issue emerges from. And then we will begin bringing the stakeholders that are involved in this type of issue together. And then ultimately, what are the public sector entities that should be in this discussion? And bringing the first parties together can also help you identify who others ought to be brought to the table and get around the table to talk.
Very good. And at what point would we need to talk to somebody with Convergent as far as kind of helping us through this kind of whole project? Really early? Would you be in the room as we're having kind of these meetings with the stakeholders, or is it after we kind of decide, we're going to go after this one issue and we're going to need some help fundraising? At what point do we get Convergent involved?
Well, I had mentioned, Tiffany, that, writing down the plan and the business plan, I mean, we will be able to help you kind of refine the plan, but you must identify the issue and capture it because what Convergent is good at is refining what we call the case for investment. And our job is to take the case that you all have created and basically take it to all of the various stakeholders who would be involved in the actual funding of that and helping you identify what are the sources of funding that we can bring in that will help us get this job done. And then, obviously we're going to make asks and we're going to try to secure a lot of that funding. But as I mentioned too, sometimes then we'll suggest that advocacy on the part of the chamber is important too, because perhaps where we won't be able to play is like with the legislature or the congressional members to have federal funding or state funding coming from state and federal governments to you. But we can certainly work the private sector. We can also make asks to local governments at times. But the case is so critical because that's our selling tool. And that we use that as our selling tool when we take it on the road.
And what's really kind of the time frame, Steve? If they've determined kind of the issue that they want to tackle, what do you see as kind of or is there a normal kind of time frame? Is it different community to community?
In terms of fundraising, it's going to take a variety of time frames. If we're out there to just generate, let me just use a number, $10 million or less. We'll probably get that done in about 8 months, 8 or 9 months. But as you look at these massive projects that really require a lot more, it's going to take a lot more time. And we may end up being there, with you, 2 years or so, as we work on these things. And sometimes things just open up and fall from the sky that we are not planning for, and things can be done quicker. But when we do economic development campaigns, typically for economic development organizations who have a 5-year strategic plan, those we usually do a feasibility study on the goal that we are trying to accomplish for them first. And then that takes about 4 weeks. And then after that, we determine, okay, can we achieve that goal? We think there's a pretty good shot of it. And then a campaign ensues. And the campaign usually will last another 8 months or so, 8 to 9 months. So that's typical of a project.
Fantastic. All right. Any questions before we let Steve go today? I don't have any in the chat right now, but feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. All right. Well, Steve, that was great information today. Thank you so much. As a reminder, you're going to get an email from me with Steve's contact information, a link to this recording, and his slides. So feel free to reach out to Steve. Thank you to Convergent for being a partner of ours for so many years. Excited to be with you and your group. Hopefully, we'll have somebody with us at our annual management conference coming up later this year. But, Steve, thank you so very much for your time today. We appreciate
My
it.
pleasure, folks. Thank you all for tuning in.
Take care. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye now.